The streets of Israel are boiling over with protesters against the judicial reform that the government is planning to implement. While many call for a compromise, the coalition is moving forward with legislation in the Knesset as its opponents are mobilizing and threatening to shut down the country. To discuss this situation, the Jerusalem Press Club speaks with member of the Knesset, Dan Illouz, from the Likud party, who is himself an advocate of the reform. Illouz, a lawyer by his trade, finished his law degree in the McGill University and also served as a member of the Jerusalem City Council. MK Illouz, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I'll start with a simple question. Were you surprised by the magnitude and maybe also the volume of the protests against the judicial reform?
I'll be honest, I was surprised by the magnitude. I think that the reforms are very good for Israel's democracy. I know that not everyone agrees with that. And so I did expect some pushback. The magnitude is strong. I think it's based a lot on people misunderstanding the basis of the reforms. And that's the reason actually why I'm here, in order to try to explain these things and get people to understand better and thus calm down and feel less fear as to what is happening. I don't expect everyone to agree with the reforms. I don't think that ever happens in democracy, that everyone agrees on a certain issue. That's fine. That's part of the dynamism of democracies. But I do want people to feel less fear, to understand that the democracy is not going to be hurt by these reforms. I believe it's only going to be strengthened. And that's the reason why I'm here today.
Okay. And again, thank you for joining us. Let me ask you, why do you think we need this reform? And as an advocate of it, what's the most important part of it?
So since the 1990s, Israel has been in a trend of more and more power to the courts, to the judicial branch, at the expense of the legislative branch and the executive branch. Now, we know that everywhere in the world, there are arguments about how strong the judges should be, how active they should be. In Israel, it's quite unique because the judicial branch is actually nominated in a very unique way to Israel by a professional committee, which nominates the courts, where politicians do have a say, but they have a minority say. And it's mostly what's called a professional committee. Now, even professional people have political ideas and have political positions. And so the feeling in large parts of Israel was that there has been a complete disconnect between the values that the court promotes and the values that the general population of Israel believes in. And so in order to fix that, we're trying to bring these reforms that will strengthen, once again, the judicial branch, the legislative branch. And by the way, I have to say also another important element is that all of this was happening while Israel does not have a written constitution that's been agreed upon. We have basic laws, which are laws on constitutional subjects, but that are regular legislations. They're not a constitution that's been enshrined as there is in the United States or in other countries such as Canada, etc. And so all of this makes it even more harder to explain why the courts have taken on so much power when they don't have really a constitution to base this power on. And so what we want to do is to return the things the way they used to be, where the main power is in the Knesset. It's an issue of parliamentary sovereignty, which is really the basis of democracy in the English tradition, which Israel inherited, right? The British tradition that Israel inherited. The issue of parliamentary sovereignty is incredibly important there. And that's what we're trying to do, to bring back the power to the Knesset, ensure that the Knesset, first of all, has the last word, but also that the Knesset is involved in the nomination of judges. Here I have to be very specific. In the nomination of judges, the way it's done in most of the democratic countries, once the judges are nominated, obviously they will stay completely independent. They have to keep their judicial independence, not be influenced by politicians. This is what's accepted all around the democratic world, and this is what we want to implement here also. The nomination needs to be by elected officials in order to really enhance the representation in the courts, and in order to make the values of the court closer to the values of the people. But once they're elected, they have to be completely independent, 100% independent. And that's something that we completely agree on and that we also want to implement here.
So let me ask you, many civil servants, also in very high-ranking positions, include those who might not have an agenda on this issue at all, such as maybe the Bank of Israel's governor. They criticize the reform. They claim it might hurt the strength of Israeli democratic institutions. It might hurt the balance between the checks and balances in Israel. Are they wrong? Why are they wrong, if you may say?
So I'll say two things. There are some who criticize the reforms based not on what the reform says, but rather they're afraid of the repercussions, not necessarily of the reforms, but also of the opposition to the reform. People being less intent in investing in Israel, or things like that. They're afraid of the repercussions, not only of the reforms themselves and what they include, but also of the backlash of the protests or of the opposition to the reform and things like that. There, I want to say, I think that the protests have sometimes been completely irresponsible. When I see people from the opposition going around the world and trying to convince foreign diplomats about why the reforms will bring the end to Israeli democracy, not only is that not true, I think it's also a very unpatriotic thing to do. And so I think that the criticism should be to the opposition, who's really fanning the flame of fear, and then that fear might indeed cause problems to Israel. That's one of the things. The other thing is, I do agree that some people criticize the reforms, also on the content of it. I personally like to quote Erwin Kotler, who's a mentor for me. He was my law professor in Canada, and he opposes the reforms. I disagree with him on that. But what I like, he wrote a piece in the Globe and Mail, the leading Canadian newspaper, or one of the leading Canadian newspapers. And what I like in what he did is that he explained all of the reasons why he opposes the reforms, but afterwards he was very clear about two things. First of all, he said that he usually is on the side of judicial activism. He opposed the override clause, the notwithstanding clause, as it's called in Canada. Also in Canada, it exists in Canada. He opposes it there, and he opposes it in Israel. He's someone who opposes usually the judicial restraint. But the second thing, which is even more important, is that he made it clear that even if he disagrees with the reforms are not an end to the Israeli democracy. In no way is that true. The reforms, you can support them, you can oppose them. It's an argument that exists in most democratic countries. How activist should the judges be? Should they be restrained or activists? However, in the end, even after the reforms will pass, Israel will still be a dynamic democracy, and it's going to be a very democratic state the way it has been since its creation. That won't change.
Yes, but many people also say that when advocates of this whole reform are asked about the possibility of giving the coalition, the Knesset, absolute power, too much power, and how will they defend human rights at the same time? And they answer that they need to be, trusted, and that they won't do like things that might hurt human rights as they didn't do in the past. But the opponents are saying, how could we trust you as you now, pass this legislation even without talking to us?
I don't. First of all, I don't think it's about trust. I'll give you an example. The main question, I think, which bothers people, and to me, it's the most important question, but the protests are the most opposed to this question, is the question of nominating judges. So as I said, not only is the question of nominating judges a question that we see in all other democratic countries where the elected officials are the one nominating judges. I just want to take this example in order to see why the fears are sometimes unfounded. Some people fear that if we change the way of nominating judges and we give a lot of power to the coalition in order to do so, then we'll have only members of the Likud in the courts. However, that's not true, because first of all, the coalition changes and judges are nominated not always in one government. They are never nominated only in one government. They're nominated when one person retires, the other person gets nominated. And so it happens as a process along the time. And this happens when we have a different coalition. Once it's a right-wing coalition, the next time it can be like the previous coalition we had, which was a diverse coalition with very strong left-wing elements. It might be a coalition where the ultra-Orthodox are in the coalition. It might be a coalition where they're outside of the coalition. And so it will always be a different type of coalition that will nominate those judges. We won't have a uniform court, we'll have a court where along the line, along the way, different people have nominated judges. The way it happens, again, everywhere in the world. That's the way in the democratic world. That's the way it's done in Canada. That's the way it's done in the United States. It's done in most of Europe, etc. And so it's something that when you tell people the coalition will be able to nominate judges, they usually think only of the current coalition. But that's not what we're saying. We're not talking about the current coalition will nominate all the judges on the Supreme Court. We're saying whoever is in the coalition will nominate the specific judge replacing the judge that retired at that time. And so at the end, we'll have a very balanced court. We won't have a court that represents only the current coalition.
Okay, you are a member of the Likud, and we want to ask you, as the governing party, why won't the Likud accept the many calls, including from right-wing parts of society, to adopt a compromise that will still see many parts of the reform pass and improve, by your definition, the current situation? And at the same time, why won't you stop the proceedings in the Knesset until we reach such a compromise?
So I actually think you asked two very different questions, because the first question, I think, is not, to be honest, not accurate. The Likud has been calling for a compromise ever since we started. And to be honest, on a political level, this is something which is actually weird, because usually the government party is not the one asking for compromise. The governing party has the majority, and it can basically pass what it wants with the majority. However, we care about the unity of Israel. We care about the fears even of the people in the opposition. And so we do want a compromise. And we've been calling for a compromise ever since the beginning of the legal process, the legislative process. And we actually came out in support of the efforts of the president. We're not sure we'll support what he presents in the end, because we don't know what it is. I can't support or oppose something without knowing what it is. But the very efforts that he's doing in order to try and lead to a compromise is something we support. And we called on opposition parties, come, sit with us immediately. We're still saying it immediately. We can right now sit down and talk and try to get to a compromise. Unfortunately, we've been completely ignored. And the opposition has been saying over and over again that it would not sit with us until we stop the legislation. Now, that gets to your second question. Why shouldn't we stop the legislation? And I have to say that I don't think that this is a fair demand. Legislation is a process. It's a long process. We've been talking about these reforms for the past month, basically, and we're still going on, more than a month, and we're still going on because we have this process. The time that legislation happens is actually the best time to have discussions, to try to get to a compromise. And that usually happens, by the way, in the committees in the Knesset. I think that's actually the ideal way that this should happen. But even if that ideal way is not good for the opposition, we've been open to have discussions in other forums and try to have it behind closed doors or publicly, or however they want to do it. To be honest, we've called on it. We're not willing to stop the legislation because to us, it's just a way for them to try and get us to stop the reforms as they start negotiating with us without any real intention of getting to a solution. If they want to get to a solution, we're open. We can do it while the legislation is going on. It's a long process. There still is enough time where towards the end of the process, because they've been saying no for so long, but we still have enough time. It can happen even today. All they need to do is to agree to sit and talk, and we still hope that it will happen. Again, as a coalition, we don't have any interest in saying that. We can pass the reforms that we believe in as they are. But in order to protect the unity of Israel and the people of Israel, we're willing to get to a compromise. All they need to do is come and sit and talk to us.
Interesting. Now, when you imagine such a compromise, how would it look? Like, what parts that exist today in the reform won't be in such a compromise?
So again, you're asking for me to give the end of a negotiation before we even negotiate it. I will tell you that that's the other side of the coin of what we spoke about in your last question, that there's been things that have been included in the legislation along the process, even without us talking to anyone. So we can call them one-sided compromises. For example, the fact that judicial review can happen not with a majority, not with a unanimous calling of 15 judges, the way Simcha Rotman wanted, but 12 out of 15 judges also. That's a type of compromise that happened one-sidedly, and that we incorporated even though there wasn't anyone to talk to. When it comes to the reasonableness clause, just to explain to the viewers, the fact that the courts can cancel an act of government because it sees it as unreasonable. So initially in our proposal, that would be completely canceled because reasonableness is something very subjective, and we don't want the courts to decide what's reasonable or not reasonable. I think that if I do something and believe that it's reasonable, then that should be good enough. The courts shouldn't be the ones deciding it. So we're agreeing right now, and we've said it publicly, again, as a one-sided compromise, that reasonable clause will still be affecting the government, but not the elected officials in government. In other words, it will be for CEOs and for civil servants, etc., not elected officials, because elected officials should be responding only to the people who elected them as to whether what they're doing is reasonable or not, and not to courts, again, when such a thing is so subjective. And even on the nomination of judges, we've seen that Yariv Levin has agreed to the idea of compromising on this. I cannot say exactly what the compromise would look like. Obviously, again, as I said previously, this is probably the biggest point of contention between the protesters, between the opposition and the coalition. So it will probably be the hardest thing to negotiate on. But there is, even on that, willingness for us to talk and to see if we can get to a compromise.
Okay, now you spoke about the judges, about the court. What will the coalition steps be if the Supreme Court disqualifies the whole reform? Could we reach a scenario of two opposing decisions from the Knesset and from the judges? How will the army respond? How will the police respond? What will happen here? Which decision shall prevail?
Listen, I honestly cannot believe that the courts would go this far. I think it would be unprecedented in the whole democratic world, and definitely in Israel, but also in the whole democratic world, that the courts would cancel a constitutional reform by an elected government that includes changes to basic laws that, again, the basic laws, although they're not a constitution, they're the reasons why the courts have taken the power to intervene in politics in the first time, in political questions in the first time. And so now we're changing those basic laws, and what's the basis on which they can intervene in these laws? I don't believe we'll get there. I think that the courts will be responsible, even though there's people on the right that think that I'm a bit naive, but I believe that the courts will be responsible. But to be honest, that's one of the reasons why I think it's so important to get sitting down and talking, because if there is a compromise, and we hope there will be a compromise, we hope the opposition will sit down with us and get to a compromise. If there is a compromise, then the chances that the courts will intervene are even lower. They're already low. I know that it's doomsday scenario that people like to speak about in order to speak about the doomsday scenario. It exists, but it's a doomsday scenario. I don't think we'll get there, but the idea of getting there would be even more ridiculous if it comes through a compromise. And so I want the opposition to be responsible and to come and sit and talk to us for us to get to a compromise.
So if we see like a major compromise with, the main parties of the opposition, Yesh Atid and Gantz's party, do you think that Israel will go back to the normal course of life as we had before elections, maybe?
Listen, the protests are, I would say, 90% patriotic people who I disagree with, but who are patriotic and who love the state of Israel and who want to see a good future for the state of Israel. They're afraid right now. They're afraid again, we can interpret why they're afraid, whether it's because of misinformation or whether they're really afraid of the reforms, but that's an argument we can have another time. Their motivation is patriotic. You do have some people who are just opposed to Netanyahu for whatever reason, and that they won't accept any compromise. They'll still be protesting there. They were protesting before the reforms, by the way. They'll be protesting after the reforms. They're usually the fringe group that blocks roads, that calls for violence. They're a very fringe group that will exist even after there's a compromise. But I don't think that they represent the great majority of the protesters, which again, I disagree with, but that I fully respect. Because they're going out and protesting, and that's really the democratic duty of every person, to protest when you feel that there's a need to protest. And so they don't represent a great majority of protesters. And so they'll keep on protesting, but it's going to be at a much lower level. It's going to be protests more similar to the protests we had against Netanyahu even before those reforms were presented.
Okay, maybe my last question would be, would you dare guess what are we going to see in the coming months?
I believe we'll get to a compromise. Again, I'm an optimistic person. This is what I want. Again, I hope that the compromise will keep the main elements of the reform, which I strongly believe in. But I do believe we'll get to a compromise. I think it's in everyone's interest in the end, even though I'm not sure the opposition understands that right now. But I think that when push comes to shove and we get down to the real time, we'll get to a compromise, and that's also my hope.
Great. MK Dan Illouz, the Likud party, thank you very much for your time and for joining us today. Have a great day.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed that briefing by the Jerusalem Press Club. If you did, like the video and hit the subscribe button to stay up to date with all of our future content.